Okay, welcome to another iPad painting tutorial. On today's tutorial I'm going to paint a summer sunset scene over grass fields with some long grass in the foreground. Some really nice vibrant colours as well. Now I'm using the app Procreate on the iPad, but you can probably use a different app on a different tablet and still follow most of the techniques and the things that I'm going to show you as well. But I am using the app Procreate, and as such I've opened a default A4 canvas size and I've pre-selected some colours, and you can see this colour palette here. Now each of these colours has what's called a hexadecimal code attached to it, and when you go to this value section you can type the colour codes one at a time. So if you look in the video description you'll notice all the colour codes for this palette are there for you to copy, type them in here, the colour appears up here after you press return, and then you can start piecing it together yourself. Or alternatively, there's a link also in the video description that takes you to my Patreon page and you can download the colour file for free. And whilst you're there, you'll also find links for my TikTok, my Instagram and a Facebook group. Now in terms of the brushes I'm going to be using, well, I only ever use the default brushes within the app, and unless I specifically say that I've changed the settings on them, then I just use the default settings. And predominantly I'm going to be using the airbrushing brushes, the soft brush at the top of the list and the medium brush. Within the artistic brushes I'm going to be using the leatherwood brush, and then within the sketching I'm going to be using the 6B pencil. So with that all said and done, let's get started. So on our first layer, layer 1, I'm going to go to my brushes. In the airbrushing I'm going to select the soft brush. I'm going to go to my colours and choose this first colour, so I'll just clear that so it doesn't confuse you. So these are the colours that I'm using. So the first colour is this blue, but it's pretty greyed out. Now please be aware that the colours on camera might look a bit more vibrant than they do once you download the colour palette. I provide the colour palette so that it is accurate to the colours I'm using. If there's anything that's changing the way that the colours look, it's the camera that I'm filming on. So I've got the airbrush set to 15% size and 100% opacity. And I'm going to draw a stripe all the way across like this. And then staying on the same layer, I'm going to go to my second colour, which you can see is quite greyed out, but it is an orange colour. Stay on the soft brush, and just so it slightly overlaps, I'm going to do that colour. It doesn't have to be a perfect straight line at all. Then I'm going to go to my adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'm going to blur it in to about the 50%. And then I'm going to create a new layer. Go back to my colours, pick the third colour along this time, and I'm going to reduce the size of that now to about 10%, and just the lower part of those two colours that we've created, lower part of that fade, I've added that orange stripe. Go again to the adjustments, the Gaussian blur, and again I'm going to blur it in, this time to about the 40%. And we're going to create another layer. Go back to our colours, and we've got this fourth colour, which is a really strong orange now, and we're going to reduce the size of that down to about 7%. And again, just where it starts to fade out at the bottom of that colour, we'll just do a stripe of that orange. Again, we'll go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur it in, not as far this time, so we're going to do it to about 30%, like that. Then we're going to create another layer, go back to our colours. We will come back to this yellow and white when we add the sun and a really vibrant light to the scene. But I'm just going to move forward with some of the main elements of the landscape first. So I'm going to move to this first colour on the second row. I'm going to swap my brush to the artistic leatherwood brush. I'm going to put the opacity up to 90%. And you see it's pretty strong now. And I'm going to put the size of the brush at 2%. Although 2% has quite a lot of variance. So if we go on the 2%, there's a lower end of 2%, which is quite thin and narrow. We don't want it to be quite that thin. And the top end is really quite a broad stroke. So just a little bit back, somewhere in between those two. So like 2.5, if you can, just as you nudge into the 2, knock it down a little bit, find somewhere that's somewhere roughly in the middle. And then along this line, again, where it starts to fade out, I'm going to just start adding in some textures, some points of interest, some trees, all the way across that horizon line. So the brush itself is going to do some of the work for you, but you are still in control of the way that it undulates across that horizon line. So you can have it going up as a general swell here, and then it maybe goes down into a bit of a trough. And you can probably hear that I'm doing quite a lot of tapping. I'm allowing some gaps to remain too. So I'm just creating slightly more bigger, rounder gestures. If I want to create some slightly larger trees, they're going to be slightly more defined in terms of that shape, and maybe some slightly larger features over this side too. Doesn't have to be particularly well defined at all. And then I'll just turn the size of the brush up to 3 or 4% and then just start to fill in below that point a little bit more. Just be careful, try not to undo the textures and that tree line that you've just created, but below that point we just want to block in. There's no point changing to a different brush. You can do it easily with this brush, and we'll just fill in below that point. Then we'll go to our adjustments. We'll go to the Gaussian blur. Gaussian blur is our friend in a lot of these effects and layers. It just softens the look sometimes, as well as the more dramatic things of creating blurred skies. It is really good for just subduing some of these textures that appear a little bit sharp. So we can just slide that texture along now. We don't want to go too far with it, but about 2% just softens some of these edges in a little bit, makes them slightly less. Like if you put it down to 0, you can really see the sharpness of that texture. It doesn't quite work. So when we put it up to about 2%, it just softens it in. You can go too far, but somewhere between, 2 and 3%, either one kind of works. I think 2% is enough, and click out of it. Okay, so we're going to create another layer, and still using the leatherwood brush, we're going to switch our colors to the second color along, which you can see is a very dark yellow-green, but we're going to put the brush size down to about 2% again, and again at about 90% opacity. And you can see, hopefully it's a subtle feature. I'm just using it to pick out the top edge of something perhaps that's just a little bit closer to us. And it's just picking it out a little bit more. So it's a separate feature now from the background. So they are very much more distant. And then we've got a line of features that are just pulled a little bit closer to us. And then we can do something similar over here too. Again, you don't need to be agonizing over this too much. And then we could turn the opacity down somewhere to about 50%. And then we could just create just a suggestion of more texture in and amongst some of this background area. So it's not completely flat. Maybe we turn the brush size up a little bit more. So the top end of 2%, just soften that in a little bit. It's going to be obscured as soon as we start putting some vibrant sunbeams and sunlight in here. But still, I think having those subtleties in and amongst all of that, it does help. So just touches of those kind of textures in and amongst all of that just stops it looking quite so flat. Then we're going to move along to the third color, and we're going to basically do the same thing, but it's just even more precise. So the lower end of 2%, and then go in and amongst even more of this, perhaps even down to the 1%. And again, just pick out the top edge. Certainly as we come towards the center, it's really going to react more dramatically to the sunlight. So I'm just going to warm that up a little bit more just in this area. And back to our colours. And I'm actually going to jump back because I think that's quite dull. I'm going to go for an even more vibrant version. So I'm going to go back up to the third colour on the top row. And again, stay on this same layer. There's no point changing. I'm just going to go back in and just subtly start to bring out even more vibrancy in these details here as well. I don't want to overdo that. I'm just bringing out a touch more, specifically where the sun is going to be shining the brightest. And I also have this colour on the end. Okay, so I'm going to create another layer, and I'm going to change the brush again. I'm going to go this time to, let's have a look, we'll go to the airbrushing and soft brush again. So soft airbrushing and medium brush, and we're going to change colours. We're going to go for this green on the end, which you can see is again a very yellow green, but it is darkened. And we're going to put the brush size at 2% and about 60% opacity. And I'm just going to start, and I'll put the brush size up to about 5%, and I'll put the opacity up to 90%. And I'm just going to draw our grass, cutting all the way across. Now I'm going to hold it and let it snap to a straight line, just so it gives us a nice clean edge, and we can always soften that line a little bit. So I'm going to turn the size of the brush down to 3%, and I can just go in there and soften it a little bit as required. Let it kind of undulate a little bit more. Soften it in, that's fine. And then I'll just turn it back up and bring some of that further down into our scene. In fact, we might as well just drag and fill it and then just get rid of any anomalies. Now it's a pretty flat, horrid, vibrant green at this point, but we're going to soften it, we're going to do various things to it, so it's fine. So we'll stay on, in fact we'll change the layer, we'll create another layer, and we're going to continue to use some of the colours we've already used for the background trees, and we're going to use these now to add texture to areas of this grass too. So I'm going to go to the darkest colour, and I'm going to go back to my artistic and leatherwood brush, but I'm going to put it up to about 4% size and keep it at about 50% opacity. And I'm just going to start creating noise and texture in this foreground area. Now, there's different ways you can use the brush. If you go sideways, it creates a different effect than going up and down. As you can see, there's almost like these little ovals that it's made up of. And if you go side to side, then it drags them that way. And if you go up and down, then it drags them that way. So I'm going to use them up and down, I think is a more useful direction. So again, maybe about 3% size. We'll stay on the 50% opacity. And just with an upward gesture, I'm going to continue to create texture like this. Now, we are trying to create the sense of texture in grass. So this upward, up and down gesture pushes the actual shapes within the brush and is further going to enhance this sense that it's grass that's going straight up. So it's not just about the brushes that you use, it's also about the way that you use them, the gestures, the direction. It all makes a difference. So I'm going to allow bigger shapes in this foreground area. So I'm just trying to create a general sense that we have some break in the flat. Now, although I'm generally pushing the brush up, I am also going left to right with it. So it's a combination really of the two. So I am dragging it across, but I'm generally sort of flicking the brush upwards too. And as we get further into the distance, we'll get a narrowing of this type of texture, and the extent to which I'm moving up and down gets slightly less. But then as we get closer to us, I can thicken up these textures and the brush travels a little bit further, or quite a lot further as it gets closer to us in fact. And then as it gets further in the distance, I'm doing the same thing, but I'm doing a much smaller movement with the brush. So it's almost like I'm just dragging it left and right at that point, but I'm still letting go of the brush. I'm not just dragging it across because that creates a very different effect. I'm moving the brush across whilst also slightly pushing the brush up at the same time. So there's lots of individual marks actually, little gestures. I'm creating a layer or layering of these stripes that cut across. And if you want to do the distant ones even more, you can reduce it down, put it down to 2%, and then you can build in this narrowness, subtlety of thin stripes as it gets further away. Now I'm basically just going to apply that technique all the way across, back up to the 3%. When we get closer to us, we can allow this to be bigger shapes. We're going to do some foreground grass, tall grass features over the top of this anyway, but it does no harm to have this as a base. The bigger gestures as we get closer to us, obviously. And really this is about perspective, isn't it? So when things are closer to you, like stripes for example, the stripes are going to appear broader and you'll see that texture more, and as they get further away, we'll make sure it's at the lower end of 3%, and we're just getting a narrowing and a reduction in the size for the distance. And then obviously in the middle areas somewhere between those two. Now this is just the dark colour. We're going to switch to a lighter colour to pick up highlights that runs along the top in a moment. And slightly along that top edge, just to break up that top edge a little bit if it feels a little bit too sharp and precise as we go along there. You can just set a slightly different horizon line there, almost where the grass meets the trees. If you feel like that edge is not quite right, then you can just shift and adjust it. So that's the base that we want. And I'm going to create another layer so we don't mess it up. And I'm going to switch my colours. So I've used that colour. we've got that as a base. So we've got the dark and we've got the vibrant green. I think I'm actually going to go back to the top row. I'm going to use that colour, but I'm going to have to reduce the strength of it down from 50% down to about 30%. Let's try that. We're going to stay on the artistic brush, the leatherwood brush, put it down to about 2% size, and then where we have a dark shape, the top edge of that in places might just be bouncing back some highlights. So again, subtlety is going to be our friend here, so you don't want to overdo it. I usually say that just before doing too much, so I'm telling myself as much as anyone. We can just go into this and we can just start to, with exactly the same texture that we've used on the darker textures, just start to apply this warm highlight texture over the top as well. And we've not yet added the sun to make sense of all of this, but I think if you lay the stage and the setting for that light feature, then it's just going to appear all the more believable and dramatic too. So I'm just going to continue adding this light texture all the way across over here too. We can always reduce the size of that brush even further, so we'll put it down to the 2% again and just really have a little bit more precision. So we want the combination of that dark green, the light green, and then this really highlight colour over the top as well. So those three in combination is what's going to create that nice effect. And I'll just do some along this top edge as well. Remember, this is the focal point where the sun is going to be. So you're definitely going to have some more of it here. I might go in here with an orange as well, I think. I think whilst we're at this point, I'm actually going to start introducing the sun now, because if I don't add it at this point, it's going to be difficult to make sense of the rest of it. So I'm going to create a new layer, go back to my colours, and we've got this orange first of all, which I'm then going to, with a soft brush, so I need to go back to my airbrushing soft brush, put at around 15% size again, but turn it down to about 15% opacity. And just in this center area, I'm going to bring it in a few times here. And just draw out this shape where the sunlight is going to be. Then I can go to my layer properties. Where it's got an N, I can change that and I can put it to add. And you can see the difference that makes. It makes a general overall glow and really enhances the look. So I'm now going to create a new layer, go back to my colours again, and I'm going to use this yellow, but I'm going to put it down to about 10%, keep it at about 20%, and we're going to have the sun in this area. So I'm just going to tap a few times for that. And it's going to appear darker now as a yellow, so it's not really quite what we want either. So again, we're going to go to the N, I'm going to put it on the add. It's a bit too pronounced, but that's not a problem because we can just go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just blur that in a bit more, just so it softens it in. And I think around the 20% should do that. And then I'm going to create another layer, go to my colors, I'm going to use the white, and I'm going to change the brush this time. So I'm going to go for a medium brush. I'm going to put it at around 5, in fact, now we'll go a bit bigger, 8%, and we'll put it 100% opacity. And I'm just going to choose the point now where the sun's going to be and press it a few times like that. And we'll just go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in a little bit. We'll just blur it in to about 15%. And looking through the layers, then you can decide the strength that you want on those individual. And just looking through the layers, then we can decide on the strength of those individual layers. So I'm going to click on the A, and you can see you can turn the opacity and strength of that down. So you can decide if at 100% is too strong. It probably is. So I'm going to reduce it down to about 90%, just takes the edge off it slightly, go to the layer 10, adds a yellow. So I feel like it's a little bit too strong, so I'm going to reduce it down to about 50% in fact. And then if I go to the top layer, which has the white on it, and I'm going to go to my adjustments, I'm going to go to the bloom setting, and I can turn that up to 100%, and that really sells that glow of the sun a little bit more. So now if we go back to the layer 9 that had that warm orange, I'm going to continue to use the medium brush. I'm going to go back to the orange. I'm going to put the brush size really quite low at 3% and really low on the opacity at around 5%. And I'm just going to start building down some sunbeams really. And it's subtle, and I don't want to overdo this, but I'm just going from the imaginary center, but I'm just going from the center of our sun and building in some general sunbeams, allow it to venture down into our scene. Now, you don't want to overdo this. It would be very easy to overdo this. And I've got it deliberately set at 5% size so that it prevents me from going a bit over the top. And as it gets further down, you're going to get a broadening of those sunbeams. So it's narrow as it obviously gets towards the center of the actual sun area, and then it gets broader as it disperses further away. But then, you know, it also gets fainter as it goes further and broader. So you're going to see more of a pronounced, sharper line as it's closer to the sun, and then it spreads out and diffuses once it gets further away. Okay, it's quite a subtle feature, but I do think it makes a big difference. And that will do for that effect. I'm going to create a new layer. So go to the top layer and create a new layer on top. And then I'm going to go to my bottom two colors, and you can see I've got this color, which is a yellow orange, but it's quite a pastel version. So it almost got like a salmon type look. I'm going to change my brush to my sketching 6B. I'm going to have the brush size at about 40%, but I'm going to have the opacity really quite low at about 30%. And I'm just going to start building in some grass. Now, the end of the grass is made up of lots of little textures. So if I zoom in a little bit, you'll see lots of individual little textures here at the top. And then it reaches a point where maybe we just get a line that grows from it. And you can repeat this a lot. So we're changing the direction up slightly. So we've got this texture and thicker region at the top, and then you get a thinner stripe that just goes down from there. And we're going to repeat this lots of times. So it's a really simple technique, but it's about the combination of loads of this together. Now, when you're doing a stripe down, you want to do it quite subtle. You don't want a strong stem for your grass. So you want it quite thin. Most of the concentration is really going at the top of the grass, and then you're just lightly pressing for the rest of the grass stem. And obviously we want it changing directions a lot too. Again, this is another feature. You don't really have to be too precise on it. You can keep it quite subtle. Your imagination is quite good at filling in the blanks. If you just create a suggestion of these things, then, you know, we kind of fill in the blanks in our imagination anyway. It's really useful to know how little actually sometimes you need to do in order to create that effect. Now, sometimes you're going to get a slight curve to the top of our grass as well, and then we get a thin. Sometimes you might get a couple that overlap each other. So keep building it up. And if you wanted to just do the top sections first, and then you can really concentrate on all of these, decide where you want them to be, and then you can go in afterwards just as a quick exercise and add the stems for the grass. Let's keep building it up anyway. So I'm just going to fast track through some of these. So I'm going to be doing a lot of this, but in addition to that, I've got a light green, and we can go in there and we can just add some green grass shoots as well. So it's a combination of the two effects really. So we've got these light blades of grass that are going to be intermingled. Not as much of this perhaps, you're just going to have a suggestion of it here and there, just to really break it up and create a bit of variety. But then the majority of the time, we're going to be spending on the lighter colour for the top of the grass. So you can alternate between the two, but you need to do quite a lot of this grass. If you don't do enough of it, it's not really going to create the effect I would suggest. So take the time, don't shortcut this too much. Even though it's quite a laborious process and step, I think that it is the secret to making this effect work. But I'm going to just fast track you through this so you can see the overall effect build up quickly. So again, alternate between that colour and the grass and just keep building this up. And this is the kind of area where I suspect some people will, struggle with, because it is so time consuming. This is the bit that requires the patience. So as much as these tutorials are about finding shortcuts in many instances and finding the easiest way to doing things, I'm afraid sometimes it just doesn't take away from the fact that you need to have patience. You need to be prepared to put the time in and just enjoy the process. And I said this before, but I think if you're not enjoying the process, then I think you're better to find hobbies that, the actual doing of it is more enjoyable to you as well. Because I do think that half of art is about the enjoyment of the doing of it. So as much as, you may want to achieve that overall effect, and that's certainly a satisfying part of it, I think if you're not enjoying the process, then I don't know. I wouldn't stick at it if I didn't actually enjoy the doing of it as well as the final outcome. But that's my personal perspective on it. But I think unless you enjoy this kind of thing, life's too short really to agonize and devote so much time to it. But this is the kind of detail that does require the time put in. So settle into it, enjoy adding the texture, build it up until you are satisfied with it. Typically, these paintings take me about an hour, and I then edit them so that they whiz by faster and appear more like about half an hour's painting. But in reality, it takes me about an hour. But I'm doing a fairly loose version of these, so feel free to spend longer on this, get more into the detail, make it even more accurate, more realistic. Or you can just follow exactly as I'm showing you and just achieve the overall effect, whatever suits you really. I see people that do my tutorials and often they've spent longer on them and the results are more impressive than the version that I show you during these tutorials, and that's really delightful to see someone taking the techniques and spending the time with them and really showing off how far it can actually take you. Okay, and again, we've got this light green, and I'm just going to continue to break up some of this texture just to add a little bit more noise into this region. Now we also didn't do too much of the stems, did we? So again, in and amongst all of this, you want some of these stems for the grass. You don't need to really do very much for it. You can just build in some, and you could change the colour. We've got a very light colour here. We could even go in with the orange in places. Start to build in some of that. You don't want to do too much of that because it might just overpower and look too strong, but when it's in the mix, it can really help. And I'm just going to create another layer. I'm going to put it underneath all the grass that I have created. That way, if I'm using this orange, it's not going to interfere too dramatically. It's not going to overpower the other elements, but I can just, like I say, add it to the mix, knowing that it's not going to create a weird orange stripe or line that cuts across everything, but it is adding that sense of glow and extra texture, which is useful. And we're just building up the density of textures in here, which is great. The more you're willing to spend time adding this complexity of layering texture, I think the better it will look. And then maybe we'll go to a dark colour as well. So we've got this texture in here. There's nothing wrong with adding some lines that cut through here and add a little bit of darkness back in. In fact, let's go to our airbrushing. Soft brush, we'll have it at around 6% size and about 30% opacity. And because it is a layer underneath the main grass, we can probably just build in some extra darkness here in the foreground. It's not going to interfere with the textures we've just added, but it's just building up a little bit more contrast into our scene. It really will help highlight the grass here at the top, which is great. I feel like I want to create a new colour, so I'm going to go for my yellow, but I'm going to make a much more white version. In fact, I'm going to make it slightly warmer as well. So I'm going to go for a brand new colour that I'm adding here. Now, it won't have been there at the beginning of the tutorial on the colour palette. It will always have been there. So you probably noticed it even if it wasn't on my colour palette at the beginning. So I'm going to stay on the 6B pencil. I'm going to have it at around 40% size. I'm going to have it about 30% opacity and just on our grass layer. So I don't need to create a new layer for this. And I'm just going to subtly, in fact, I'm going to turn the opacity down, probably put it about 10%. And I can just go over a couple of these blades of grass as they stick up. I don't want to overdo this. Just in this area, it's a real subtlety. I think you could so easily overdo this, which is why I've got it on a low opacity. And I'm just adding it a little bit to these most prominent. They're just sticking up into the sun rays there a little bit more prominently. So they just need a hint more light on them, but don't overdo that. There, and that's probably enough just to highlight them a little bit more. So I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to put it underneath my grass layer this time. I'm going to change the layer properties from normal to add. I'm going to go to my brush. I'm going to use the leatherwood brush. I'm going to use the orange that I used before, and it's going to create a similar effect to what we were creating before, but I just want to extend some of the light impact on bits of this grass. So we're going to have it at 2% size and put it down to about 20% opacity. And I'm just going to build up the impact and the reflection of that light on bits of the grass. So just like we've got sunbeams coming down, we're also going to get stripes appearing on the grass. So it might just be that the sun, for example, peeks through an area of the trees here and just creates a beam of light that cuts across the grass. Really creates a little bit more drama in this area. And we can keep some of the dark textures in there, but just cutting across the tops of some of this texture, it's just picking up highlights of the grass. Something like this. And it can all start to collect together a little bit as it goes further towards that sun. And then as it comes further down here, it breaks apart and becomes more fragmented, less obvious as a solid shape. Then it builds together into more of a solid shape up here, and we could do something similar over here as well. Perhaps a bit more diffused over this side. And again, we can I might as well just stay on the same layer. I'm just going to further highlight some of these blades of grass that stick up. I don't want to change the shape of it too much though, but it just creates that little bit more of a glow for one or two of these, just to make them really sing and stand out. Just turn the opacity up and the size of the brush down. Really, one or two of them can just really almost have a fiery light and glow to them. And then maybe in the sky, I'll just add a couple of birds or something. Just a blob with a couple of wings, really. You really don't need to go into a lot of detail for birds. Okay, I think I'm going to leave that tutorial there at that point. If you've enjoyed following along, make sure to hit that bell notification button next to the subscribe to make sure you get notified of future tutorials. If you do have a go and you're pleased with your results, make sure to tag me if you're going to post them on Instagram, or join the Facebook group and join the community there and get feedback and give feedback as well. It's a really great place to be part of. I hope to catch you back here soon. See you later.